If you took CSS 101, you should already know 3 display types: inline, inline block, and block. In this video, let's go ahead and demo the difference between all 3 of them because this is vital to know for the rest of this course. So I have my editor open here, and I went to File, Open, and then I opened a folder called Lesson Files. I'm going to create a new file in here called index.html. And in here, let's do HTML:5, hit tab, and it creates our page for us. And let's call this working document CSS 201. Now, there are 3 different display types in here, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a div. I'm going to actually create 3 divs and show you the differences between them. So div, this is the first, copy that line. This is the second, copy that line. And all I'm doing here in VS Code is Control-C, Control-V, and it seems to copy the whole line down one for me. And then this is the third. Now I'm going to go over to my browser, and I'm going to go to File, Open, and I'm going to open index.html. And okay, we see a boring page. But what we can do here is just demo this quickly. And again, this is super vital to know. So we have 3 divs here. Let's go ahead and create a new selector. Let's go ahead, and all I did there was right-click, inspect, and clicked on one of these divs. It doesn't matter which one. And click this little button over here that says New Style Rule. I'm going to make this bigger as well. Click this button. It's going to automatically give me a div, and we could change the display type. Now we can't change this one because that one comes default with our browser, but we can overwrite it, and we can say display block is what it currently is. Let's give this a border though. Border 1 pixel solid red. And this is what display block looks like. And this is in vast contrast to display inline, where all the elements are side by side. And then we can do inline block, which doesn't really look like it did a whole lot. It is moving it down just a touch there. And what inline block allows us to do is padding 10 pixels, and we could do margin 5 pixels if we wanted to, 5 pixels. Now we can do a margin, we can add a padding with a block element as well. And we can toggle these on and off if we wanted to. Now, one thing to note is inline looks a little bit different from inline block. So we can do inline, inline block, and just moving this up and down. I'm just toggling this with my up and down arrow keys. And so this is inline block. And it's important to notice those differences because we're going to be using inline block a lot in this course. And this is block. We're also going to be using this. So these are the 3 display types that we're going to get started with in this course. And it is absolutely vital that you know these because we're going to be working with things like flexbox, and grid. And those are not easy to sort of wrap our heads around. So we need to be pretty familiar with that. And we covered that in CSS 101. If you're in that course, definitely feel free to go back to the display lesson in CSS 101 where we cover this a little more in depth. Okay, let's take a look at the box model. This is something we didn't cover in CSS 101, which I really wanted to, but I think it was slightly too advanced. So the box model is this idea that you have a box and you can have padding and margin, and it depends on your browser's rules on how to calculate the width of that element. So if we create a div here, and let's just call it div class box, and that's all we're going to do. I'm going to save that. Come on over to this page, and I already pre-opened this before I recorded this lesson. So if I go to inspect, I'm going to see that in my body, I have box, and I can add a class here for .box. And let's add some styling. So border 1 pixel solid red. Let's give this a height of 300 pixels, a width of 300 pixels. And let's change that border. Instead of 1 pixel, let's do like 5 pixels. And now when I come down here, when I scroll all the way down, we can see that it's 300 by 300. Okay, cool. Now, if I wanted to, I could add a padding here. I could say padding 30 pixels. And you notice how when I toggle this on and off, it makes my box bigger. And that's not necessarily what I want, because when I add padding 30 pixels, this box is no longer 300 pixels. It's 370 pixels wide. It has 5 pixels on either side for 10, 5 on the left, 5 on the right, 300 pixels on the inside, and then 30 pixels of padding on the left and the right. So if we add this up, we have 5, 30, 300, 30 over here, and another 5. And if we scroll on down, we can actually see all these numbers here. Border of 5, padding 30, inside of 300. Now, sometimes that's what we want, but for the most part, that's not what we want. What we want is to say, make the whole thing 300 pixels wide, or 300 pixels tall, and that includes the padding. So by default, the box model, what we're looking at here, our box model here, does not include having padding, does not include having margin. So what we can say is box sizing, and by default, it's content box, but we want border box. And you can see that it makes it bigger or smaller here. And we're changing the default behavior of our browser. Typically, we want border box. What border box does is says, add that border, add that padding, and make sure all of that together is a width of 300. So now when I hover over this, we can see that that box is a little bit smaller. And when I scroll on down, none of these digits actually change, but the box itself is smaller. It's saying the entire thing is 300 pixels. That's the difference between border box and content box. Now, what I would like you to do is give this a shot. Create a 300 by 300 box on your page. It does not need to look good. Add some padding to it, and then change the box sizing and just notice what the difference is. And this is really, really important for us moving through this course because we're going to be using content box a lot. Okay, let's take a look at outline. Outline is the border that goes around everything. It's honestly the border around a border. You can add an outline and you can tell it to have an offset. We use the outline offset to give some space between the element and your outline. We'll demonstrate that in just a second. But basically, outline is like having two borders, and it's really nice for visual improvement. Now, most of the time, outlines are actually super important for accessibility. So whenever you hover over an element, or when you tab over, like when you use a keyboard and you hit tab over and over on your page, sometimes a button will have like a yellow outline around it, or a red outline, or a black outline. And it's not the border, it's just this outline. And it tells screen readers and people with visually impaired handicaps, people who can't see very well, what is actually selected. It also, for those keyboard warriors out there who like to use a keyboard instead of a mouse, it helps them a lot. And there's a lot of them out there. So it's really, really important. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to save this as a new file called outline. And what I want here is I still have this box. And what I would like to do is add an outline around it. So if I go here, and this is just leaving off from the last lesson, I'm using the exact same file. It's okay because I'm just in the editor here in the inspect tool and our developer tools. I can add an outline, and let's make this just a wee bit smaller. I can add an outline. And it's a lot like a border. So I can say 5 pixels, solid, black. And you can see that it's actually on the outside of all of it. Now, if we look down at our box model, it doesn't even show up in here. We have an inside, we have a padding, we have a border, we have margin on the outside, but it doesn't actually really show us anything about the outline. And so that's the difference between a border and an outline. A border is actually calculated, an outline is not. And you can see this, it doesn't actually make our box move at all. It just literally adds an outline around it. Now, there's a way to add an offset. We can say outline-offset, and we can give this a pixel value as well. So let's say, not 4, let's give this a 10 pixel offset. And we're going to want to add some margin in here. So let's do margin 30 pixels. And what this offset does is it just moves that outline outwards. Now, what I would like you to do for this particular lesson is create an element and give it a border, then give it an outline. It doesn't really matter what your color is. You can just give it some sort of outline. I just did something boring, 5 pixel solid black, and then add an offset to it to demonstrate that this can be moved outwards. Text shadow is a lot like a box shadow. The only difference really here is that a box shadow can have like an inside shadow called an inset, and text does not. All right, so what I'm going to start doing here is I'm going to write internal CSS. Not external CSS, not inline CSS, but internal CSS, so that when you download these project files, you can actually have access to all this CSS. So I have a box in here. Cool. And Let's go ahead and add some text in here. And this text is going to say, hello world. And when I load this up in my browser, it just says hello world. We can make this significantly bigger. We can change the font size if we wanted to a little bit later, which actually maybe we'll do as well, just so that we can really dive into CSS. So let's select that box by our class. We learned about this selector in CSS 101. And so all this is saying is select this element by this class name. Give this a font size of maybe like 40 pixels. Let's save and refresh. There we go, that's bigger. And now what we can do is we can add a text shadow. So text shadow, and this takes an X, a Y, a blur value, and the color. So let's go ahead and change that X value. We want to move this to the right, let's say 10 pixels. Then the Y value is also going to be 10 pixels. That's going to move it downwards. A blur, let's say it's not going to blur at all. So it's going to be an exact copy, exact outline of our text. And the color here is going to be red. Just something obnoxious that we can really see what's going on. Now we have a text shadow that moves this down 10 pixels and moves it to the right 10 pixels. Now, if we wanted something a little more elegant, we could do something like 2 pixels. And by the way, to select this, all I did was select my 10 pixels, or it's now 2 pixels, but I selected that 10 pixels. And if you go to selection, add next occurrence, for me, that's Command D. It's going to be different for you, probably, I can imagine. You can just type in 2 places at the same time, which is really, really useful. It's a good shortcut to remember. Let's go ahead and save that. Let's refresh, and that looks a little bit better. Now, we can also add a blur value. This blur value currently is 0, which is the same as not having it whatsoever. By default, it's not blurring at all. Let's go ahead and add a blur value of 5 pixels. And all this is going to do is say, for every pixel that's back there, every red pixel, blur it out 5 pixels. And so we have a nice little blur there. It actually looks like this is coming off of the page a little bit. Now what we can do is we can actually change the body background color. So body background color is going to be black. It's going to be the same color as our text. And let's go ahead and refresh this. And now it looks a little spookier. Now I'm recording this around Halloween, so this is really, really, well, this is applicable because this is kind of spooky. But we can't see that text anymore, which is really nice. We could also try to, instead of doing that, we could do a color, RGBA, and it doesn't really matter what color we fill its color. Let's fill it with black, but let's also make it completely see-through with a 0 alpha in there. And now we just have the blurred text. So that is text shadow. What I would like you to do is write some text on your page. It could just say hello world, and then add a text shadow. Add your x-axis, your y-axis, or your horizontal and your vertical alignment. Add a blur, and then add a color. You don't have to do the RGBA. We learned about that in CSS 101 as well, so if you need to, go back to CSS 101 and quickly learn what RGBA is, but really it's just a color mode. It's saying red, green, blue, alpha. Alpha is your transparency. So we said 0, 0, 0, that's black. Make it completely see-through. All right, so this is minimum width. We are going to be talking about what that is. Now in CSS 101, we learned about maximum width. We learned about regular width. If you don't know about max width, honestly, it's the exact same as minimum width. However, it's the opposite. So it's same, but different. Now, maximum width says an element can only have a maximum width, and it will try to go from the smallest size to that maximum width before breaking your text onto a new line. Minimum width is sort of the same, but opposite. So I can select this box here, and I can give this a border, 4 pixels, solid blue. And let's go in here and throw some lorem ipsum in here. Lorem, and then in VS Code, I just hit tab. And that's because I have Django template selected here. This should be an HTML. Let's undo that. Lorem, tab, there we go. And when I load up this page, we can see all this text. Now this is actually sort of a bad example. I'm gonna just delete everything except this one line so that we have this width in here. Let's go ahead and delete all of that. Save and refresh. Okay, so now this is not actually going to do anything because this is a block element. And remember that first lesson I said block element display is really, really important. So let's go ahead and trim this. we want to make this not take up the entire width. So we can say display inline block, and this will allow us to use the width element with it. However, it's also going to take up a minimum width here, which is really nice. So this element here is 365 pixels wide. So we want a minimum width of something just a little bit bigger. Let's give this a min width, and let's say that minimum width has to be 450 pixels. And so what this is going to do is sort of move this out to somewhere over here. Oh, pretty good game. That was a pretty good guess. So it's going to move it over here, and if I write more text, it's going to then expand, and we can actually see this by going in here, and I'm just going to copy this line a couple of times, and you can see that it expanded all the way over. So it has that minimum width, and all I'm doing here is undoing and redoing, but it has that minimum width, so it doesn't matter if there's extra space or not, it's going to take up that minimum width. And then once it has more content, possibly too much content, what it's going to do is then move this to be 100% width. Now we can marry this with max width as well. So we can say the max width can only be somewhere out here. So let's go ahead and combine these. We can say a max width of, let's say, 500 pixels. Refresh, it looks like nothing changed, but what this is going to do is say somewhere about here probably is the maximum width. So before this blue border was taking up this entire width, this one no longer will. So I'm going to double click in here and paste that a few times. And we can see that it only takes up to here now. And our box element, if we go down here, 450 pixels wide is what it is by default. Up here, it's 508 pixels, and that's because it's taking up 4 pixels on either side. So 500 pixels on the inside, 400 pixels, 4 pixels on either side rather. And we can change that. Box sizing. And let's do border box, and you can actually see it's making that little 8 pixel difference. Border box, and if we go back over here, we can see the whole element is 500 pixels. So now we're already using the display stuff that we learned from our display lesson. We're also learning and using box sizing from the box sizing or the box model lesson. So this is min width. The idea again here is just that it's going to be a minimum width, and if you have more content, it can grow to be larger. Positioning is how we move elements around a page. There are a few ways to do this. We can do absolute positions, we can write a relative position, a fixed position, or a sticky position. There's also another one called static, which everything is by default. But the idea is that if you want to make a pixel perfect website, something that really matches the design, sometimes you're going to have to move elements around. And in the next few lessons, we are going to be talking about relative positioning, absolute positioning, fixed positioning, and sticky positioning. And this is what's going to make your site start to really act more like an app, especially when it comes to sticky positioning, but it's also going to help you move things around so that we can create new dynamic components that can layer on top of each other. Relative positioning is the idea of taking an element and moving it from one place where it naturally sits on your page to another place just slightly off. So it takes your position where you're sitting or standing right now, and it's like moving you 1 inch to the left or 1 inch to the right. So I have a new document here for relative positioning, and what we want to do is create a box and then just sort of move it a little bit. So let's go ahead and grab that box class. Let's give it a width, 300 pixels, height, 300 pixels, border, 10 pixels solid black. And when I open this up in the browser, it's just a regular box. We've seen this a few times already throughout this course. So what I want to do here now is I can say position, and there's a bunch of them in here, but let's go position relative, and it looks like nothing has changed. And that's actually right, nothing should have changed. But now we can use top, left, right, or bottom selectors, or not selectors, but properties. So we could say move this from the top, move it downwards. Let's move this down 10 pixels. Okay, so that wasn't very much. Let's move this down 30 pixels. And let's move this to the left, or from the left, 30 pixels as well. And when we toggle these on and off, we can actually see that this is in fact moving. It's moving the entire element for us. And so again, what relative positioning does is it says, okay, so this is where your element sits by default on your page. But let's change that position to relative. So relative to where it usually sits, from the top, move it down 30 pixels. From the left, move it to the right 30 pixels. So let's say instead of top, we can say bottom. And you can see that I actually moved it out of my viewport, the viewport being this big white section here. And we can toggle that on and off as well. And instead of left, we can say right. And this does the exact opposite. And let's toggle these on and off as well. And so that's relative positioning. Now, where this comes in really, really handy is when you have to move something just slightly off of where it naturally sits. Maybe you're already using your padding, you're already using your margin, you're using negative padding or negative margin, and you need to sort of move this away just a little bit, just to make it perfect. This is where relative positioning really comes into play. Now, relative positioning has another sort of superpower, and that's when it comes to child elements that use position absolute, which we're going to talk about next. Absolute positioning lets us move an element based on its parent element, but the trick here is that the parent element has to be position relative. So taking over from that last lesson, what I have here is just a regular box. And if I go back to my editor here, let's go ahead and change this position to not absolute, but relative. And that's this box in here. And let's make some space to work. And this really does nothing from that last lesson. Now, where this gets powerful, where absolute positioning comes in, is let's say I have a second box. So let's do second dash box. And this is an Emmet abbreviation. So if you're just joining this course now, you haven't taken CSS 101 or HTML 101 or HTML 201, where I talk about Emmet abbreviations. All I'm doing here is writing a little bit of CSS. And as soon as you see this Emmet abbreviation, you can hit tab. And it creates a div for you by default with a class of second box, just like writing CSS, and then you just hit tab. And let's say this needs to be in the top right. So let's go back to our page here and refresh, and this just says top right. Now we can add some styling to this, and let's say it needs to be a box in the top right quadrant. What we can do is now select this box, and we can say second box, position, absolute. Let's also give this a border of 3 pixels, solid, blue, just so we know where we're working. And when we do position absolute, literally nothing changes. It just added a border around here. I'm going to zoom in even more here. Now, what I would like to do is for this to move into this top right quadrant, as if I was making a graph with an X and Y axes, and it has a negative X and a negative Y axis. What I can do is, because this is position absolute, I can now say, let's stick this to the top. And that's going to say 0. It's already there by default. But in case your element isn't, what this is going to do is move this to the top of the page. And as an example, let's do bottom. So bottom 0 is going to say that position absolute around this relative element is going to stick to the bottom. And then we could say right 0. And now that moves it to the bottom right. Now to move this back up, all we have to do is change that bottom to top. So we set position absolute, top is 0, right is 0. And all this is going to do is move this to the top right. Now that is what we wanted, but we want it to take up like this full quadrant here. So what we can do is we can say a width of 50%, and let's try a height of 50%. And now we have a box in that top right quadrant. And that's what position absolute allows us to do. It allows us to do something like this. Now, this is sort of an ugly example, but if we wanted to, we could give this a background of black. And let's go ahead and get rid of this border. And now it looks like we've carved out a chunk of this. Now, if we want to get even fancier, we're often not going to be working with borders all the time. So let's go ahead and get rid of this black border on our parent element, the box, the relative element. Let's go ahead and get rid of that. And now we've moved this box somewhere where it doesn't live naturally. So there's this 300 by 300 box. You can see it here. And we've said out of that 300 by 300 box, take 50% of the width, 50% of the height for 150 by 150, move it to the top right. Now I'm just going to quickly undo that, and I'm going to show you what happens when I take position relative away from the parent element. So I'm working on the box here. And if I get rid of position relative, it goes straight to the entire page. It takes up 50% of the page's width and it takes up 50% of the page's height, or the viewport actually, not the entire page, but just the viewport here, which could very well be the same thing depending on your page. So yeah, if you ever want an element to sort of be absolutely positioned, you have to make sure your parent element is using position relative. Now, it's not doing any harm. You'll notice that when I toggle this on and off, that box on the left here doesn't change whatsoever. It just changes the behavior of its child elements. And this is a really important concept to understand in CSS, because when we get to the end of this course, we're going to be working with a lot of child elements. Let's take a look at fixed positioning. That's a hard one to say with a microphone. Fixed positioning. Fixed positioning sticks an element to a certain part of your viewport, and it lets you slide down the page as the page moves down. That was actually a terrible example. You know when you're on a website and there's a header, and it's got like navigation and a logo and stuff, and as you slide down the page, it slides down the page with you? This is fixed positioning. Now, I just reset my page to have a style and a box. Let's select this box and add some styling. So this box, let's say, is going to have a border, 1 pixel solid red, and a background color of, let's make this look a little more elegant, F5, 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 and let's not do border 1 pixel solid red. Let's do border bottom, 2 pixels solid CCC, and you can see those colors show up here. So it's an off-white and a light gray. And let's just change this. Okay, there's no content in there, but let's add some content. Say this is a header. Okay, let's zoom that in the opposite direction that I'm going. And okay, so this doesn't look great. Let's actually clean this up a little bit. Let's get rid of that body margin. Let's do this. Body. Or is it padding? I can't ever remember. But let's do margin 0. Let's just reset this and padding 0. So that these corners of this header actually touch the sides. Perfect. And in that header, let's go ahead and give this a padding of 40 pixels. Nope, that's far too obnoxious for this demonstration. Let's do 20 pixels. Okay, that's not looking too bad. We can live with that. Now, let's say we want to scroll down the page. Now, I don't have enough content to scroll down the page here, but what I can do is say that body needs to have a minimum height, or a fixed height of, let's say, 3000 pixels. And all this is going to do is let me scroll all the way down, as if I had more content. Now, what if I wanted to scroll down and I wanted this to stay with me? We can do that. And all we say here is position fixed. Now, this might be a little bit janky depending on the browser you're using, depending on the version of the browser you're using. And you can actually see it is a little bit janky. This is sort of like an inline element, an inline block element, and it didn't take up the entire width. What we need to do is set a value, top, right, bottom, or left value. And what we can do is we can say, stick this to the top of the page, make it stick to the left of the page like it currently is, but also give this a width of 100% of the page. And I'll just move that up a bit. And there we go. Now I'm scrolling down the page and you can actually see my sidebar over here. As I scroll, it's staying sticky. Now this is a very bad example. A better example would be if I have a paragraph in here and I throw some lorem and I just copy this over and 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 over again. And so we're going to be able to see that this page can actually scroll. So I save that, refresh. And at the top of my page, I've got my lorem ipsum. But as I scroll down, it now stays with me. This is fixed positioning. This makes it sort of sticky to the top of the page. Now, sticky positioning is a different type of positioning. We're going to tackle that one next. However, fixed positioning is really, really nice because it's going to layer on top of your entire page. So you know when you're on a website and it has that annoying little thing at the bottom right, and it's like, message us for support or whatever, and it's on like 50% of all websites these days. It's kind of irritating, to be honest, but it sticks with you no matter where you are on the page and it layers on top of everything. That's what position fixed does for you. Now, what I would like you to do is give this a shot. Create a fixed header like what I have. Throw a bunch of content in here. You're going to need enough so that your page can actually scroll, and then scroll down your page and make sure that it just layers on top of everything.